sports are really important vehicles for relationships.
We have purpose. We have a why. We bring people together. We connect.
I feel like God is our greatest supporter and our greatest coach.
Welcome to Rabbi on the Sidelines. This is Rabbi Erez Sherman from Sinai Temple in Los Angeles. This week we are joined by an amazing author and professor, author of this unbelievable book, How Basketball Can Save the World, Dr. Professor David Hollander, Assistant Dean and Clinical Professor with the Tisch Institute for Global Sport at New York University. He's received NYU's highest Distinguished Teaching Award, sitting on the advisory board for many organizations, including ESPN and the NYU Entrepreneurial Institute. David, it's so good to have you at Sinai Temple. Welcome to this rainy Los Angeles.
If you could do something about the rain, that would be a miracle.
Well, thank you for bringing the rain here, actually, as you relieved our drought. But this book, because I want to hop right in, there's just way too much to talk about. This book, How Basketball Can Save the World, it's based on James Naismith's 13 Principles of Basketball. And when people put rabbis and basketball together, they think it's almost like a joke, but your book proves how serious faith, basketball, and life really need to be.
Yeah, so the 13 principles that I have in my book are just a numeric homage.
Not the Maimonides principles of 13.
No, but I'd love to do a podcast on that completely. My 13 principles are just what I've extracted as a philosophy of what the game was intended to be from Naismith, how the game is operated in the world, and what the world has told us it means.
And so we're sitting in a sanctuary, which now is a podcast studio, but I'm going to start from the end of your book because the last two chapters are called Sanctuary and Transcendence.
Yes.
There's a beautiful quote from the great Kevin Durant, and he says, "God's got his hand on every court in the world." What did Kevin Durant mean by that?
I think Kevin Durant is a really big thinker. His mind was expanded when he stepped on a basketball court. And I think it was expanded because he entered a social system where all of a sudden he could feel ownership of his creative, entrepreneurial, all the kinds of self-determination powers and empowerment that a person feels when they're in that space, operating with other people, that perhaps they don't feel in other spaces that are more restrictive for all kinds of reasons.
And that sanctuary and transcendent aspect, you talk about a lot the playground as a sanctuary. You said in your class, you don't just sit in the classroom, but you go to these playgrounds in New York City, Rucker Park, the Cage at 4th Street, and it really reminded me as a young child of meeting the other at the playground. But even as an adult, when I go back to that playground, I see that that was the sanctuary that was created around me. So what is that moment of playgroundness that becomes a sanctuary for the youth, which then leads to good in adulthood?
There's two things about a playground. One is that it's, I think, one of the last best free, totally accessible communal spaces there is. Nobody checks your ID. Nobody asks for your proof of citizenship. Nobody does a credit check. There's no commissioner. There's no gatekeeper. You come, and the only rules there are the rules that are assented to by those who are present. And what happens typically is you come amidst a group of strangers, people who don't know each other, all of a sudden have to find ways of knowing each other. That's the kind of social empowerment, the kind of like way that people begin to connect and exercise and build the muscle of empathy. The sanctuary part is really, it's a space of play. People like to say sports is like life. It's not like life. Life is sprawling, incomprehensible, unpredictable. It's a very difficult thing. Play is the space that removes. You can still exercise all the vices and virtues, cowardice, leadership, grace under pressure, without the real life consequences of hunger, loss, death. So basketball, for many people, maybe it's because of the fluid movement, maybe because of the small space and the personal connection, serves as this stabilizing space where you can begin to hear yourself in a world that, well, we're so often surveilled, tracked, counted, algorithmatized. This is a sanctuary space. And I was just at Harvard Law School, and I asked them, do you think we should have a fundamental right to sanctuary? And every one of them, some of them may be Supreme Court justices one day, raised their hand and said, yes, it's a 21st century thing.
And so you mentioned that we can maybe dive deep into the Jewish value aspects, tzedakah, tikkun olam.
Sure.
But sanctuary, makom kadosh, a holy place. We're sitting in it right now. What should this sanctuary mean for us, not taken out to the basketball court, but for the basketball court's rules to be brought into this place?
When you create a space where people come, the point of their coming to this space is to emerge from the space spiritually healthier, as a better person, as someone who operates in the world with more compassion, more equanimity, more wisdom. How do you do that? Well, you come and you do the ritual exercises. You pray, you daven, you recite the prayers. It's the same on a basketball court. You go to that space and you do the ritual exercise. You play basketball. You have that interaction, that eye contact, that close, personal kind of relationship with a total stranger. And then you emerge from that space into the world, better able to walk on the street, better able to manage your body, better able to see around you, better able to be a community member. I find them to be perfectly analogous.
It's actually interesting because when people walk into the space, sometimes only twice a year, they think that they're going to hit the half-court shot without ever trying for a layup. And that analogy also, I think, really hits home, as actually my mom always used to tell me, a synagogue, a house of worship, a sanctuary should be a place to play and to pray. And I think basketball, in connection with that, does exactly that.
If you find yourself feeling some ambiguous or hard to kind of articulate feeling that is unsettling, loss, you feel like something's missing, you're probably not getting to that space, that sanctuary, and you need to go. It's a very human thing, these sanctuary spaces. They're essential.
So something you didn't talk about, but I want to ask about, because I wrote a piece on theology about this many years ago, was the role of a coach in basketball. And this distinction between coach and player. I actually wrote a theology called God as Coach. Not coach as God, but God as coach. What is the role of a coach within this system of individual and collective that you speak about in the role of basketball, not as an individual sport, but as you said, this sort of weaving together of characters and personalities to achieve the goal of putting a ball in a basket?
James Naismith expressly, and by the way, I love coaches. I've so many things I've gotten from coaches in my life have brought me to moments of clarity that I have today, or the few I have today. Naismith invented a game that was meant to be coachless. When the great Fog Allen, who he recruited to play for him at Kansas, said, "Hey, I'm leaving Kansas. I just got a coaching job." Naismith famously said, "Basketball is not a game you coach; it's a game you play." That was the first statement ever of experiential learning. This is the fast break. You can coach the fast break only by practicing being and doing in the fast break. Life is an experiential learning process. You learn by doing, you learn by being alive, you learn by being in the world, and by constantly participating and practicing and trying to figure out what you need to be as the facts and circumstances on the ground change. It is a self-reliant game. It is a game that forces you to look at those around you and figure out how to solve problems in the moment, in the world. The coach, well, that's a superstructural addition to the game that is organized. There's no coach on the playground.
Mm-hmm. And so if the game is coachless, then what would be your characteristics of a Hall of Fame coach? Phil Jackson, Jim Boeheim, Coach K, Popovich. What makes a coach?
Yeah, John McClendon.
Yes.
These are coaches who have great scholarship and wisdom of these principles, and they create the environment, they promote the relationships that allow this kind of collaborative problem solving, this kind of awareness of your constant balancing of the individual and collective while you're on the court. Basketball's not a game where rarely do you get to perfectly set up like in football, like or do you step out of the batter's box to take a minute and really think about what you're going to do, like in baseball. Basketball is a game that is positionless, and it is fluid. Bill Russell once said, in the time it takes you to write the semicolon, the play's over. It is not unlike life, and I teach. How do I teach my students? I give them some very fundamental principles on how this game is played, and then I throw them on the court. I throw them in the water. I have them experientially learn how to figure stuff out.
Actually, Father Hagen, who's the chaplain of the Villanova basketball team, associate athletic director the last 17 years, told me a couple of weeks ago, Jay Wright's famous directions to his team is always next play. Next play, and throwing them out to the next play in order to prepare them for what we don't know is in fact coming next.
The greatest coaches weren't micromanaging. The greatest coaches weren't controlling. John Wooden,
sitting in Westwood right here.
Right, he had these. I was just in his. They have a replication. It's actually the actual stuff from his study in the Wooden Center at their Hall of Fame. He wasn't trying to call a timeout every minute to figure out what to do next. He gave them really broad principles of thinking, of life, of moral values, and then asked them to exercise those in motion.
I think, again, the same thing with faith, right? We don't stand on this pulpit and tell people what to do, but we exercise the moral values so that they, the players, the congregation, the community, can in fact go out and do that as well. So what I didn't realize before I read this book was the moments of faith, or the aspects of faith that James Naismith himself had in his life, that he could have been sitting on a bema and I could have been on the sidelines. So maybe share about the story of the saint of basketball and connect that to James Naismith, the preacher.
So I love that you picked up on that. It is a remarkable thing that James Naismith was an intellectual wanderer. He was traumatized from the early loss of both his parents, orphan. He graduated divinity school, and to the heartbreak of his sister, who never spoke to him again for the rest of his life, he said, I'm not going to take a pulpit. I think there's a better way to serve God. And this was his manifestation of what he thought was the best way. It was about the body working with the mind, working with the spirit. Yes, it came through the YMCA, through muscular Christianity, but he even went beyond that. Even his teachers there said, just use the old elements of old games. That he's like, nah, there's got to be something a little different. And he elevated the goal, and he created a totally different sport. The story of the saint of basketball, years later, I hope James Naismith would be proud. I'm reading around Christmas time, 2021, in the New York Times, that there's a church in central Italy, a little village called Porretta Terme, and they have a church. It's since the 15th century, and in the church there's a shrine to basketball. And people come from all over the country to pray at this shrine for a better season, better jump shot, a healed meniscus. And I read that the village is frustrated because they made petition to the Vatican to have their local Madonna be recognized as the first ever patron saint of basketball. Wow. I read this story, I'm like, this is my class. And I call my TA, who's Italian. He's working at NBC Sports in New York now. And I said, Alessandro, can you believe this is us? He's like, I know. He's like, I'm home in Bologna for Christmas. He goes, the church is not that far. He drives to the church. He grabs the priest. The priest, the first guest in my first class, How Basketball Saved the World. First hour. And I'm like, Father, what can I do? How can I help? He's like, I don't know. I'm like, class, no grade, 157 students. I'm like, everybody send me one sentence. Why does basketball deserve its own saint? And I put this together in a letter, like a huge letter, like a Declaration of Independence, because basketball is, knows no boundaries, because basketball has no faith, no language. And I send it to the Pope. Italian media gets a hold of this somehow. La Repubblica, which is like the New York Times of Italy, and they published the letter in full. And it's like this feature story, like this is the first international gesture of support, this crazy NYU professor and his students. This may push it over the edge. That was March 2022. On Good Friday, April 12th, the Pope recognized the first ever patron saint of basketball.
And Pope Francis said, I quote, "Yours is a sport that lifts you up to the heavens because it is a sport that looks upward towards the basket. And so it is a real challenge for all those who are used to living with their eyes always on the ground." When I read that, I thought it was a beautiful thing. It actually reminded me of the Psalms. In Hebrew, we say, Esa einai harim, lift up your eyes to God's mountain. Where will my help come from? That is the 10-foot basket.
And look, as you know, I'm not Catholic. And you may wonder, why did the Pope do this? First of all, it's the first team sport to have its own saint. Soccer, which is very popular in Italy, not soccer, basketball. It's because he knows, like you know, you're so good at this. He knows it's time for a new language, a new social currency, a new lens, a new delivery mechanism to engage the world to solve old, repeating problems.
So do we do a rabbi or a prophet in the shul? That's the question. We can't do the saints.
I'd like to know. I'd like to ask you, because I've thought about what would be the equivalent. Many have asked me.
Yeah.
How would we do it?
We'll have our meeting offline, and we'll come back the next time, and we'll figure it out.
Okay.
We're gonna go to we're gonna go to the film for a second. This was produced in terms of your class, and it talks about the fast break and the interaction between people. You spoke about COVID and how the fact that the world took the rims down because people couldn't stay away from the court. So let's see what you said about fast break and interaction with basketball.
Moving through a changing world and trying to figure out what you have to do in order to meet the needs of the changing facts and circumstances that develop in front of you with other people. I wish I could teach that in a leadership course. I wish I could teach that in a corporate culture course. Unlike other sports, basketball's a small space. It's intimate. It forces us to see each other. Other sports, big space.
So positionless, everybody running around the court, especially in today's NBA, by the way, right? You don't have that center that just stays there. You have the guys shooting the threes. Interaction with people, we spoke about earlier, different people. When I grew up in upstate New York, the people that I met were different, were not at my synagogue. They were on the court. Positionless basketball.
Many people like to talk about positionless basketball as the new state, the ultimate state of the game right now. Unicorns, they call them, 7-footers who can shoot from the outside and handle the ball. That was always what Naismith intended. His last disciple, we spoke of Fog Allen, his last disciple is a guy named John McClendon. First African-American to be admitted to Kansas as a physical education student, and Naismith went to a park, watched some kids play. Naismith said, "Hey, what do you see?" McClendon said, "Well, I see them attacking the other team when they have the ball and attacking the basket when the ball's in their hands." Naismith's like, "Yeah, that's it. That's the game." He walked away. McClendon went on to create something called the fast break, which is, people said, well, it was undisciplined, it was a crazy style of basketball. No, it's precisely the game of basketball, which is, none of us is just one thing. We all have to be what we have to be in order to do what we have to do to solve the rapidly changing facts and circumstances in a world that changes so rapidly, technologically, legally, politically. Who are you going to be when somebody says, "Oh, now it's changed, what do we do?" The people who have that kind of skill to run the break, that's the future of work. That's the future of yourself in your own organization. That's the future of the evolution of your thinking to take the world to the next stage it needs to be. Gandhi said, "Be the change you wish to see." Yes, that's what happens on a basketball court.
Actually, the Kotzker Rebbe said, don't study the Torah, but be the Torah, and the same type of teaching of Gandhi as well. And so you mentioned be who you are. There's sort of 4 topics that you discussed in this book about what it means to be who you are. 1 is race, 2 is religion, 3 is nationality, and then 4 is just the global citizen. So let's start with race. In terms of, you mentioned Magic and Larry, in terms of urban and rural, in terms of black and white. In the bubble in 2021, you saw, right, racial justice slogans literally on courts and jerseys. Has that changed? And you also mentioned one more thing, and I'll throw a lot of things in there because there's so much to talk about in this book, about the idea of owner versus officer, right? It seems like it's all one in terms of how we're living this life and what it means within the league.
You know, I use the NBA in a lot of examples in the book because obviously it's the cynosure, that's the examples that people can relate to and see often. This book in the course is not about the NBA. It's about a game that's easy to access. It was always intended to be easy to play, easy to access. It was a response to industrialization, cramped living spaces, tenements, and things like that, unprecedented immigration. Where in society, how often in society is everything so easy to access for everyone? And I'm talking about to get a loan to start a business, to start a bank account, to buy a home, for education, healthcare, all kinds of things. The unreconciled issue in the United States, let's just take one place that has one particular barrier to access problem, the unreconciled issue of race in the United States. When the church broke down and schools were doing what they were supposed to do, where could blacks go to exercise, demonstrate, feel ownership of their body, ownership of their civil rights, ownership of their economic self-determination, creatively, commercial, all those kinds of entrepreneurial instincts being developed? It was on the playground. It was on the playground where you could go and nobody said, "Who are you? You're not allowed in here." It was an open space that has led to the poetry of social protest, hip hop, all the fashion and cultural influences that have come from that. All the language of ownership was transformed. So when they got to the NBA, they said, no more calling them owners, you call them governors. First league and only league I know of to do that. We need to fight systemic inequality, systemic racism with systemic access. Access was always the thesis of basketball.
And so that's in the African-American world. Only one example in the Asian-American world is Linsanity, right? Jeremy Lin, who it seems like you're right, had the access, but couldn't get in because of what people thought somebody from China would look like or act like on a basketball court.
Yeah, Jeremy Lin is probably one of the most discriminated against athletes of our time. He was a standout champion and state champion in Northern California. Didn't get one D1 offer. Performed brilliantly in the NCAA tournament in Division I. Didn't get drafted. Linsanity was a moment where he certainly demonstrated that he belonged in the NBA, and even after that, and there's all kinds of reasons. Even the great Daryl Morey, who is adamant about analytics, statistics tell the story, refused to believe that Jeremy Lin performed analytically better in trials than John Wall and a couple other people that were valued above him. The funny thing is that basketball is beloved and participated in and consumed by more people in Asia, in China, than there are people in the entire United States. This is a game that is global. This is a game that has it gets the superstructures of it, the elite levels of it, get so trapped in the well, the gender non-inclusive, the racial non-inclusive lenses of our current societies and systemic issues. But this game, this game is way bigger than the household names that we know of.
And so you mentioned China, and I just want to bring that up because you also mentioned Enes Kanter freedom and how he speaks against the league that he was in. In fact, he was in this building, in our sanctuary, speaking about the injustices in the world and how the, if you wish, money between NBA and China, at least he says, they try to ignore that piece because there's dollars involved. Be thoughts on that fact that there is a global community, but there are some tensions between these two countries. Can basketball help that, or is that going to divide us more?
Yeah, again, the NBA is a commercial, aggressive for-profit concern. As far as leagues go, the Professional Basketball League, I think, has demonstrated way more examples of higher social consciousness than other sports leagues. As it pertains to, problems between, let's just take the Daryl Morey incident and where he spoke out in support of Hong Kong. And what was interesting to me was how disproportionate the reaction was when a basketball person spoke about it. Then other corporations, soccer players had spoken about it too. But oh my gosh, it meant so much when somebody from the basketball community spoke about what was happening in China and Hong Kong. And I say in the book, well, what should we really have been talking about? Where should we really have brought the conversation back to? What was the one thing we all had in common in this conversation? What was this love of the game? Look inside the game and why that cultural form called basketball meant so much to all of us. And maybe from there we could find something to build upon. That's where we should have went back to. Not all the commercial boycotting, the jingoism, patriotism, all that stuff. We lost sight of where the love of this thing began in the first place.
And so this is not just a book, but it's actually a class. Charles Barkley, of course, NBA Hall of Famer, says, Professor Hollander makes the case for basketball as a philosophy. I'm ready to get my PhD. This is a clip about what you said about how you took this to the level of the classroom that then spreads it to the next generation at NYU.
And its scholarship, when you look at the world and you see this battle between illiberal democracies and undemocratic liberalism, and we're trying to figure out why systems are broken, I think you can go back to some very basic cultural forms that all over the world, no one seems to have a problem with basketball. If I sit in a room and I find two people who, look at Kim Jong-un.
Yes.
A closed society that won't let anybody in except basketball players. I bet you if Robert Mueller and Paul Manafort sat in a room, they might not agree on some things, but they'll enjoy basketball.
And so you said you had 28 students that you basically begged to get in the classroom for the first summer you taught this class, and now you have hundreds. What are you trying to achieve in the classroom for these students to walk out of the NYU, How Basketball Can Save the World class?
It's a pretty bold title, How Basketball Can Save the World. It's a pretty big promise. I'm trying to get people to think differently. I'm trying to force us to answer the question, what's the point? Toward what end are we doing all the things we're doing? For a millennia, we've been led by the same kinds of leaders, monarchs, generals, religious types, economists, lawyers, politicians, with the same kinds of isms, socialism, isolationism, communism, deism, theism. And the same kinds of leaders with the same kinds of schools of thought seem to have delivered us, yet again, to a similar but different, conflicted and confused state. I'm asking us to look at new ways. When I say the word capitalism, some people stop listening. When I say the word socialism, some people stop listening. Okay, how about something else? How about basketballism? I list those 13 principles and I say, if this wasn't about basketball, if this was like a political platform or a mission statement, or would you like it? Would you vote for it? For the 21st century to solve acute 21st century problems? I'm just asking people to think differently as we move forward. And yes, we have grown. We have great success. People leave demanding a higher standard from themselves, from their family members, from the community members, seeing possibility where they may have felt, well, I don't know what to do, I'm powerless.
And so some of the projects that are now global around the world are exactly that, and they come from basketball. You specifically speak about Africa, and I watched the film Ubuntu, which means humanity. This is just a clip that you had on a podcast, the Basketball Podcast, about why basketball is global, and we'll speak about some of the projects around the world that you now have witnessed that bring basketball humanity to all.
Has allowed this game to have such ubiquity, to have such growth as the world has changed over the 130 years basketball has existed. Countries have formed and deformed, nations have renamed themselves, trends have come and gone, leaders have passed on. This thing continues to grow.
Continues to grow. Let's talk about Africa and Ubuntu, and now Africa and has players in the NBA, the general manager of the Raptors from an African nation that didn't have the playground that I had growing up. So what does that mean when basketball is raising the future leaders up?
I love what Masai Ujiri is doing. I love who he is, I love what he stands for, and I love that his call to action across the continent of Africa to promote serious endogenous economic and social development is to build 100 basketball courts, is to give that space where all the things we've been talking about, where the empathy develops, where the balance of individual and collective becomes internalized, where a space of access, you don't need much, and you can go by yourself. When you go in that space, Masai, Nigerian-born, British-raised, now in leading the Raptors, which became this remarkable galvanization point of national unity for a place that takes more immigrants than anyone else, Canada. He knows that it's in that space where those kinds of where the concept of Ubuntu, I don't know if he's been thinking about Ubuntu, this almost like a forever term, I think it's a Zulu term originally, which means I am because you are. It means there's nothing to me unless it has something to do with you. This is the story of us. This is what Martin Luther King called the inescapable mutuality. That's the point of basketball. I can't do anything without you. You are always thinking about me. It's what we are meant to do and think and be on earth together.
You probably know this one, but the Buber I-thou relationship is, I guess, our version of Ubuntu.
Right.
And I am because who you are, and in fact, you mentioned earlier, Hineni, that I'm here to help in this role. When we read the Hineni prayer on Yom Kippur, who is God? God tells the people, Eheyeh asher eheyeh, that I will be who I will be. Basically, figure out who you are, and when you figure out who you are, then only will you know who I am.
Yeah, so I think like the I-thou would be like the first principle, cooperation. Hineni would be the balance of individual and collective, and then evolving into positionlessness. I love it.
Well, maybe that's 2.0. We write the book together. The Jewish version of how basketball can save the world.
Can we please do that?
I'm there. But it's true.
You heard it here live on the air.
But I think each faith tradition has something like that,
Yes.
because we're sort of traveling the world
Yes.
now. We just talked about Africa, we talked about China. Let's go to the Middle East, where you see both, I believe in Somalia, you spoke about young girls who risk their lives in order to play, not to throw away their religion, but to say playing can be part of my religion.
That's exactly right. I do, in the principle of gender inclusion, I use this example of how basketball, for some reason, is the oasis of expression of their existence, the validity of their female existence in Mogadishu, where an extremist faction called Al-Shabaab has imposed all kinds of restrictions on women and what they can do and what they can wear. But they've specifically focused on basketball as a punishable by, like, cut off your hand or death activity. Why did they focus on basketball? And why has basketball been the space where these women willing to risk their lives? Because we know that when they go there, they feel that joy of being alive. That is the model for a totally liberated consciousness. And so I use that example in the book to talk about just one remarkable place where, yeah, they're not denying their faith in Islam. They're not denying their belief in the Quran. They're saying this is actually what it means.
And what about Hoops for Hope? When you go to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and Israelis and Arabs and Jews and Arabs who don't know the other. But I mean, Tamir Goodman, a good friend of ours here at Sinai Temple, I know you know him very well as well. The Jewish Jordan, who now has dedicated his life saying, I will bring different people together in this holy land for us all because of the ball.
I always felt like I was the Jewish Eddie Jordan. That's just a little, Lakers, Rutgers, like stuff.
Scarlet Knights, love it.
So this is a remarkable organization called Peace Players International, who was founded by two brothers, the Toohey brothers, started in Northern Ireland, where he just went and he started using basketball because it was a politically neutral sport to bring together factions that hated each other. And it worked. And somebody said to him, you should take this to South Africa. And he did. And then he went to all the highest conflict areas in the world. Israel, Palestine, Cyprus, Turkey. They're now in some of the toughest cities all over America, toughest neighborhoods where law enforcement in those communities need to be brought together. They use basketball. Why? Because of all the things we've been talking about. It's a small space. You actually see each other. You humanize. It's positionless. It's an ideal space to build those kind of relationships. They've won every award you could possibly win for sport for development, but they said, we really want to prove this. We want to scientifically really show that this works. And they did a 7-year randomized control test, the kind of testing you do on like pharmaceuticals and in a medical profession, to really make sure this works. The results? Using the Israel-Palestinian young people, the results is that it works, that it actually created tangible, measurable, pro-social behaviors. They were upstanders when people said wrong things or about the other. Because I'm like, yeah, no, I know those guys. It's all right. They would interrupt conversations in their families and in social settings and be like, yeah, that's not exactly true. They had formed friendships that they wanted to continue. Palestinian with Israeli, Israeli with Palestinian. We have to be in the same space together. There's no other way to do this. It's not going to happen over Zoom. It's not going to happen in a training program. It's going to happen if we interact in a small space, seeing each other, which means we remove the veil, the mist of some societal imposed view of the other, and we actually see people, individuals, human beings in their fullness. And it's like, oh, okay, I can do this with you. And wow, what they have proven using basketball.
See, I'm passionate, as you now know, of using that basketball in our faith spaces because it's two universal languages that we're having. Said, our God is your God is my God, and your court is my court, and this ball is your ball. And to see what can come out of that, I think, is also an important piece of the future. If you have a magic wand, let's start with college basketball because it really is my passion. It's March Madness. What 3 things can basketball do to maybe change what's happening with NIL and transfer portal and loyalty to teams and to each other? How can we fix basketball a little more to make sure these 13 principles stay true to their tradition of what Naismith believed?
Yeah. Again, I mean, we're looking at the elite levels of organized basketball, which may not be, precisely the expression of what Naismith intended or the highest form of what the game can be. But I will say this. I believe that the game needs to be seen differently. It is not just an athletic institution, it is a social institution. I'll go one step further. It's a social institution. Look what's going on in Toronto. Look how they've changed the social fabric through basketball. I'll go further and say basketball, other sports too, should be viewed as academic. You can get a degree in music, you can get a degree in art, in drama, in dance, validly, where the learning comes in large part from the doing. You spend a lot of class time doing the activity. You make art, you dance, you act. And from that activity flows all kinds of understandings of the human condition, history. How is that not true of athletics? Why is that over here and relegated to some non-academic space? The only way this thing's going to work is if you make it academic, which it ought to be. You should be able to get a degree in basketball studies because it is now clear, it is obvious, major revenue-generating Division I sports is totally incompatible with the mission of higher education. They simply do not belong together. Not to mention, it is a 100% illegal restraint of trade.
And what about the NBA? What can we do? Because a lot of things are happening now. Organizations like NBA Cares who are coming into the community when they're opening up their stadiums for access, for voting access, closing down election day so people can come to their stadiums and vote. What in the NBA can be done both on the global level but also on the local level? We're sitting here in Los Angeles with 2 NBA teams. What can we do here as Sinai Temple, as a faith community, to connect with the basketball world to make a change in the larger world?
I think not just among sports leagues, but just among commercial entities. The NBA leads. The NBA, though you may not find perfect, has the ability to demonstrate by example, by actual contribution to society, what is possible, how we can bridge gaps, how we can be global, how we can be gender inclusive. Yes, what LeBron James did by showing us, what arenas can be voting centers, which inspired Jose Andres to be. Yeah, they could also be like kitchens, and which saw us be like, they could be mass vaccination sites. Mm-hmm. We need to begin to alchemize as a society and become something completely different and thus better. As equal leaders of social conscience, synagogues, churches, mosques, all these kinds of religious organizations, I think they are ideal partners for the NBA because this is the place we need to go to. It can't just be simply fitness and not your mind. It can't just be simply intellectual development and not your spirit. It can't just be spiritual development without your mind and your body. We are coming to a new unity of growth. That's why the 21st century has been so hard for everyone, because the siloed old kind of thinking is people sense it. They can't articulate it perhaps, but they sense there's a ceiling on their growth. They're trapped in kind of like doing too much of one or the other. The balance is off. It is the houses of spirituality. It is leaders like you who can join with the MBA and give them that kind of dimension, bring those kinds of communities, and really elevate all of us.
So we started with Sanctuary, and we ended with Sanctuary. Professor David Hollander, How Basketball Can Save the World, from the NYU Tisch School of Sport. It's just truly a pleasure. If you want your PhD in basketball, Professor Hollander is the person to follow. Make sure you follow him. Buy this amazing book. You heard it right here, Rabbi on the Sidelines from Sinai Temple in Los Angeles. Have a great day.